I'm very happy to have you all here with us today.
We will be discussing the topic of the second wave of uprisings, if you want to call it this way. We will have two case studies, one on Algeria presented by Nawal and one on Sudan by Sara. And the idea is to discuss comparisons between the first and the second wave, but maybe also interconnectedness of the wave. Our second speaker is Sara Abbas. She's also a political scientist and a PhD candidate at the Free University of Berlin. She's an expert on Sudan and social movements, and she has just recently published a chapter in an edited volume that I recommend in general. Actually, I just bought it right away after seeing your list, which is called A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia. That also entails case studies on the other cases I just mentioned, like Lebanon, Iraq, if I remember correctly. And that was just published with Daraja Press and the Transnational Institute, and there will be an Arabic version coming out soon. Sara, I just pass on to you, so we will get another picture and debate them all together.
Sure, thank you very much. It was really an honor to listen to Nawal. It's very interesting because I've met Algerians who have said that because the Sudanese uprising started in December, December 2018, and the Algerian uprising started more or less, again, we're using this word started in quotes in February of 2019. But actually, it was really inspiring for the Sudanese to see the ability of the Algerians to mobilize millions really for the Friday protests. And I think that was, although there was very few direct contacts between these movements, that was a real source of inspiration for us. So I think I will also speak in the framework that Nawal has set, and I think it's something you've already spoken about earlier, which is that sort of a rejection of the idea of revolution or uprising as events, right? So this is also kind of my starting point. And I think this is very important if we're reflecting on the 10 years, not just the ways in which movements have learned from each other, but also the ways in which we ourselves are changing in how we think and analyze these movements. And also perhaps how we participate in them. So I just want to start with 10 years ago, actually, rather than the Sudanese uprising itself, because when the first wave of uprisings took place in the region, it was electrifying, of course, for the Sudanese as it was for many. I mean, I think probably there were as many people that weren't sleeping in Khartoum as there were in Tunis or Cairo, right? And at the same time, it was, I would say, that year, one of the lowest moments, perhaps, in the history of the modern history of Sudan. And what the reason for that is let's say something happened that year in Sudan that superseded on the political landscape, the Arab Spring. I'm going to use this phrase, Arab Spring. I think you can imagine sort of imagine the quotes, because I know, for example, my father, when he says it's a very American thing to do this, so I'm trying not to do it because he says he hates it. So, but imagine these quotes in the sense that I think we also can have a critique of that language, right? But that year, at the same month that the Egyptians first went to Tahrir in January of 2011, was the month where the South Sudanese participated in a referendum in Sudan to vote on whether they choose independence or whether they choose to remain in the country. And they overwhelmingly chose secession or independence. 6 months later, it actually became a fact. So South Sudan gained its independence from North Sudan, and it became the newest nation in the world, actually. I won't really get into that whole history, but I would say that both the regional dynamics, but also that moment was critical, I think, in my analysis, as to a shift in the political landscape, or a shift in subjectivities that allowed for, in 2018, for this mass uprising to take place. And one key thing that happened with that is, as much as the independence of South Sudan was experienced as a euphoric thing by many South Sudanese, not very different from the ways that many of our countries experienced this sense of euphoria during the colonization processes. But in the north, for many northern Sudanese, that event was experienced as something of a trauma, right? Because we were entering a territory whereby there was a real acute sense of failure, a very deep and acute sense of failure, that we are at the point where we are not only losing ourselves, we are losing our country, like quite literally in the Sudanese case, right? And I think there was something that began to shift at that moment, because the process by which South Sudan became independent was, of course, also a process of an accumulation of struggle over many generations. But it was really brokered by the international community. So the peace process was a very traditional format, peace process where you had mainly the UK, Norway, and the US actually formed something called the Troika, working with regional organizations, which is how the West operates mostly in Africa right now, to broker what was called the peace agreement, which didn't make a lot of sense because it was named the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, although there was no political forces really engaged in it besides the SPLM, the Southern rebels, and the government of Sudan, and both were assumed to represent their people, right? And actually, at the same time that this agreement began to be negotiated, and the big campaign was about how this agreement is going to end up ending the longest running civil war in Africa. That was one of Sudan's badges of infamy, was that it had the longest running civil war in Africa. The civil war had been in place since the early 80s, I would say since independence off and on. In fact, the Darfur conflict started in the west of the country, and it collapsed a lot of the ways in which at least the international community had set up and structured these negotiations as Muslims versus Christians and animist Arabs versus Africans and so forth, because the Darfurians were predominantly Arabic speaking, they were predominantly Muslim and so forth. And so the Darfur conflict was pushed to the side and the negotiations continued and the South split. So I think what happened then was, you could feel also partly through the economic crisis that followed. And I think it's really, really important to look at the economic issues around these uprisings. Sudan was your typical extractive economy, where it supplied in the same way that, for example, in Algeria, there's natural gas and oil. In Sudan, we pretty much supply, under the British, we used to supply cotton, and now we supplied oil, and after the oil mostly went to the south, gold, right? So it's an extractive economy. The regions where these resources are the poorest regions in the country in terms of the population, but massively wealthy in terms of resources, right? And so I think what happened then, I would say, is that slowly there was a sense that we have to save ourselves. We have to save ourselves. That there was not so much looking to the outside to save us, looking for the regime to reform. The reform agenda was very much promoted still with the national dialogues and so forth, but on the grassroots level, you start to see organizing and also a restructuring of the opposition political forces to something different, right? And so I think it's interesting that the second wave of, it's interesting that the second wave of uprisings has taken place, began really in Sudan. And it's a question whether, for example, the Reef movement in Morocco is the beginning. But let's say when we now, you already see the discourse gelling around the second wave, the idea of a second wave, and of the second wave starting in December 2018 in Sudan, in the same way that with the first wave, we talked about Tunis or Tunisia being the first wave, the beginning of the first wave. So I think it's interesting, Sudan. Why Sudan? I mean, it's a country that's very much marginal to the region. It's a country that is, I remember at some point as a child looking at some maps, and Sudan had been left out of both sub-Saharan Africa and out of North Africa and the Middle East in that map. So we're in this kind of strange position. For many reasons, we're responsible for it ourselves, whereby it's quite a marginal country to the region. It's quite metaphorically marginal. It's also geographically marginal to the region. And it's maybe not, unless you're very interested, very few people know as much about it. And I think it's quite interesting that we start to see these protests happen. Now, of course, the country was not new to protest. The regime in Sudan had been there for 30 years. Well, in 2019, it was 30 years. And there have been, I mean, the resistance to the regime is as old as the regime. So there was nothing new about the resistance to the regime. But what was different is the organization and the mobilization that was possible at that moment, that turned the spark into something much deeper and bigger, and that allowed this uprising to be sustained for months. This is something new to us as well. And I think it's very interesting. I mean, I won't get into the chronology of what happened in Sudan. I think there's a lot in the reading about it. And of course, you can ask me any questions about it. But essentially, what I want to do is to talk a bit about, Nawal spoke about how, in a way, the Algerian uprising is a continuation of the decolonial movement and decolonial struggles. And I think Sudan very much, I mean, Sudan's history since 1956, when we gained our independence, 11 years out of those years only has the country been ruled by civil regimes. I'm a bit hesitant to speak about elected regimes because actually we have this very strong binary in Sudanese historiography between what we call the democracies and the dictatorships. So we have 3 dictatorships and 3 democracies. The democracies only last for a few years before they are overthrown by military dictatorships, which are then overthrown many years later by civil uprisings. I'm hesitant to use the word elected because as Sudanese political scientist Atal Bathani speaks about, during the elected periods, there was always civil war going on. So they were parts of the country that were never able to vote. So also for me, it's incredibly important if we talk more in starting to really start a decolonial approach to how we analyze these things. Part of what we have to do is to start to really get deeper and think deeper about the kinds of terminologies that we take for granted from our own historiographies of our countries. I mean, I'm talking about those of us like me who were born in Sudan and raised, of course. I'm also a member of the diaspora from the age of 12. But to really start to look at, for example, why it was in Sudan that throughout the military dictatorships, they made such a big show, as they do in many of your countries, I'm sure, about voting or about elections. And why is it that in the electoral periods, there are people in the population who are unable to vote? So I prefer to speak, rather than the democracies versus the dictatorships, I prefer to speak about civilian and military regimes, which I think in Sudan more exemplify what actually is the shape of or the form of those regimes, right? So what was fascinating in Sudan was, if you look at and I think for those of you who speak Arabic, I included an interview that Sudanese activist Muslim Neil did, which she's an activist in the revolution, a leftist activist, which is Liqa'at al-Ishtiraki. Hussam is with us here, but they organized these very interesting discussions in Arabic. And I think it's very interesting to listen to that if you haven't listened to it, because I think it gives you a very critical but interesting take on what happened. But what is most interesting is that, sorry, I'm gonna maybe read the chat a little bit later and respond to it a little bit later because it's gonna throw me off a little bit. But I think what is interesting is the ways in which the organizations, the ways in which the mobilizing and the organizing was extremely sophisticated during the uprising. And one of the things that made it very sophisticated was the ability to connect at different levels, right? So you have the actual protests and you have the actual sittings as mechanisms, but you also had the Sudanese Professionals Association, which is a conglomeration of trade unions and trade associations that played a very important role in pushing these protests forward. Now, the real controversy starts in April of 2019, when this movement, which has been, of course, met brutally by the regime. What's really interesting is the ways in which kind of authority is delegated to the Forces for Freedom and Change, a group that includes the SPA, but also includes political parties, which then begin to negotiate with the military. And you end up definitely the Omar al-Bashir's specific administration falls, but you have essentially the military then still as an institution standing in the way that it is standing in Algeria as well, despite the death of Bouteflika. I want to, instead of going into detail about Sudan, I can do that later. I want to talk about these binaries. I know you've already spoken in this series about the idea of success and failure, or the binary of success and failure through which so much of the first wave of uprisings was analyzed. And I think you spoke about it critically, I hope. And I'm sure, knowing who's also involved in this process, that you would have done that. I'd like to point to some other binaries or discuss them very quickly, just to open up part of the dialogue. So one is the idea of protest versus state building or transition, right? So this is also something that at least we've experienced, because we've had, let's say, revolutions in 1964 and 1985 both. And there was always this clear idea that, okay, the uprising is over now, and now we go into this period of consolidation, state building, building this new society based on citizenship, right? And at least I think many examples that I will talk about Sudan, because I know it the most, this whole binary collapses completely in Sudan, because protest has never ceased actually since this transition began in August of last year. And part of the nature of the protest changes. Some of the tactics are similar. Sittings are the most common tactic right now, as opposed to street protests. However, it is really interesting that actually the contestation is really powerful right now, but more dispersed, right? And so my question is, what is invested in the idea of the uprising being over and a transition beginning, right? So let's think about that. Why is that binary there? That's a question I'm putting out to the group. Another binary is leaderless versus led revolutions or uprisings. So I'm always congratulated. I mean, the same people who were telling me in the beginning, you're going to be crushed, you're going to be crushed. Of course, we may be crushed. We are already partially crushed emotionally, of course. But the really interesting thing is you have those people, and then you have the other people who are like congratulating us on, having leadership. And I think leadership is incredibly important, because as I said, the idea of this, we all know, and I think we've rejected, and Nawal has done that as well in her presentation, rejected the idea of the spontaneity, in the sense that I think it also comes out of this idea that we're primitive in this region, or something, that like we just kind of wake up and we're spontaneously on the street one day or something. Of course, these are, like, as we said, very long processes of organizing that allow certain conditions at a certain moment that intersect with this structures that you build to organize and to mobilize it, that allow something to happen, right? But I think the leadership issue is it cuts both ways. So in our case, I think the leadership of the SPA particularly was critical, and the ability of them to mobilize people and to have that level of support that they could push these agendas at the political level was critical, right? And I think the strength is, I wouldn't call, and I don't know what Hussam would think about this, but I wouldn't call it like a strongly led revolution, in the sense that I think where the interesting thing in the Sudanese revolution was the ability to shift levels. So you have the resistance committees, which are new structures, these grassroots structures that began forming in 2013 with what we call the failed protests of September 2013, and then are able to carry this forward and organize within the neighborhoods, and the ability to communicate between different levels, right? But for me, the problem with leadership is when this delegation, in a way, popular delegation happened, what we found is a lot of the same groups and structures and political parties that had always existed, that are invested. They might not be military, they might be civilian, but they're invested in a particular class structure. They're invested in a particular form of governance as well. And it's a very elitist form of government that is very much contested nowadays by this very powerful youth movements and so forth. But I think we need to think about the fact that it's either leaders or led or strongly led, but also what role does leadership play, right? What have we learned over the last 10 years about leadership? I know I'm almost out of time, or maybe already out of time, but I think I want to also, there's a lot that I want to say, but one of them is the conflation of women in protest as feminist movements. I see that also very strongly, and you see it in the Sudanese case also very strongly, because a comrade of mine said it, who participated in the Syrian revolutions, an activist in the Syrian context, said to me, it's when women are not on the streets that we should really be paying attention, because that means something is wrong. It's not when women are on the streets that we say, wow, look at Ala Salah in Sudan, and look at her standing on a car and doing this thing, and look at Sudanese women are amazing, as are women across the region. But what we've discovered in the so-called transition is it's the organizing within these national frameworks, because these are nationalistic frameworks of these uprisings, that where class matters. For example, where you don't just speak of the military, but you speak also about what are the class interests within the military? Why is it the lowest level soldiers that were the ones that defended the protesters, right? So try to break apart these categories a little bit and look from a class dimension at them, but also try to break up this category of women, right? And try to look, my personal PhD studies women who are affiliated to the al-Bashir regime for the last 30 years and work in neighborhoods. They're also a women's movement, right? So this is incredibly important, again, not to fall into and really try to look a little bit deeper on that. And then I would say, from the first wave to the second wave, and I see maybe it's getting more attention now, but throughout the last 10 years, we haven't paid enough attention when we talk about counter-revolution to the regional and international factors of it. So somehow we're still, and it's incredibly important, but we're still looking very much at I see you, Irene, I'm almost done. We're looking very much within this borders, within our borders, when in fact, from Algeria to Libya to Egypt to Tunisia to Yemen, there is a powerful, powerful, powerful pressures that interact between the outside and the inside to structure, change, and reverse the gains that are coming out of these uprisings. So my question is, can we also think about those a bit more, that we have such an interesting group that can think across borders, right? I'm gonna leave it here. And of course, I'm sorry, I can always tell you more if you have questions, and I'm sure there will be some. Thank you so much.